Well, welcome everybody Wednesday night at the lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. And Kendall, did you hit the record button? Because I didn't hear this meeting is being recorded.
Do you want me to do that?
Okay, yes, if you could, that'd be great.
Okay, we're doing it now.
Okay,
This meeting is being recorded.
excellent. So I'll start over. Welcome everybody to Wednesday night at the lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center, and I also work for the Division of Extension at UW-Madison. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, thanks again for coming to Wednesday night at the lab. Our other co-organizers are PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and UW-Madison Science Alliance. We've started doing these by Zoom. It's still at 7 o'clock every Wednesday night, but instead of meeting at the auditorium at the Biotechnology Center at the UW-Madison campus, we get to do this by Zoom. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kristin help me out, Kristin. Krokowski, thank you.
Yep.
She's a commercial horticulture extension educator with UW-Madison Division of Extension. She lives in Waukesha County. Kristin, where were you born?
I was born in Toledo, Ohio.
And where'd you go to high school?
Central Catholic High School in Toledo, Ohio. So I grew up there, and when I was 18 years old, I kind of got out of there as quick as I could.
That'll be another talk. And where'd you go undergraduate?
I went to Sheldon Jackson College in Sitka, Alaska.
Whoa.
So my goal was to get out of town, and I always tell people jokingly that was as far out of town I could go without leaving the continent. So I ended up going there. It was an awesome education.
What did you study?
My degree is in ecosystems management. So Sheldon Jackson College is right on the Pacific Ocean. So it was basically, and it's located in the Tongass National Forest. So it was trees and fish.
Nice. And then where'd you go for your master's degree?
Purdue.
And that was in? Was that in horticulture?
Yes, sorry.
Great. And then when did you start working for Extension?
Not too long after graduate school. In there somewhere, there was the Peace Corps.
Oh, where'd you go for Peace Corps?
Kenya. So not too far after graduate school, I did a few other jobs, and then got a job in Waukesha County working for Extension. It was a gateway job. I figured I'd get my feet wet with Extension, mostly because when I was in the Peace Corps, the whole idea that you could help farmers and teach them things and you guys could grow things together was just like an amazing thing for me to learn. So that's why I went to graduate school, was so that I could be an extension educator. And then I got a job in Waukesha County and met a farmer and married him, and farmers don't move, so I stayed put.
Very good. And what are you going to talk with us about tonight?
So I'm going to talk to you about produce safety a little bit. And produce safety is something I think to a large extent happens behind the scenes to make sure that the produce that gets to people is safe for them to eat. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how farmers are keeping their customers safe. We are in a time of COVID, and farmers still want to keep farming, and they still want to keep growing produce and getting healthy things to folks. But farmers and farmers markets have had to think of different ways to go about doing that, so that they can not only grow things for their customers and keep their customers healthy, but also keep them safe from catching COVID. So I'm going to talk about that.
Well, why don't you go ahead and start your talk and fire up your PowerPoint, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks again for coming tonight.
Sure, thank you. So the one other thing I should probably add is I did marry a fruit and vegetable farmer. We sell at 6 different farmers markets in the greater Milwaukee area. So in addition to kind of the theoretical part of this, I have a lot of practical understanding of how these things get done, and kind of practical understanding of interaction with people at the market and how farmers markets run and things like that. So it really helps to have that practical end and the science end to be able to kind of mesh those two together. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about is, what is produce safety? I think produce safety is something that farmers are very much engaged in, but it's all something that happens kind of behind the scenes that people don't really know about. There are certain bacteria, viruses, and parasites that cause foodborne illness, which means if you eat the food, it can make you sick or potentially even kill you. And we've heard about these, and we've heard about them on everything from cantaloupe to salmonella in flour to peanut butter. And the goal is really to start thinking about these things to try to make sure that we're reducing that risk as much as possible. There's no way to completely eliminate risk in our food system. We do grow our produce outside. But the goal here is to really to reduce that risk and do our best to make sure that people don't have any bad reaction from eating produce. I don't know, sorry. I don't know any farmers who get into farming to cause any kind of illness. So we've all heard about foodborne illness related to tomatoes, related to spinach, related to cantaloupe. And the industry was encouraged to self-regulate for a really long time. They were given guidance of how to self-regulate. But the problem is it didn't resolve itself. So at that point, the government decided, if you can't fix this yourselves, then we need to step in and put in some regulation for you. The Food Safety Modernization Act was passed in 2011, and this covers the entire food system. This isn't just produce and farming. This is canning, food manufacturing, a lot of different things. So it also includes all the produce and food that comes in from overseas. So I have a lot of people ask the question about, well, our farmers have to abide by these regulations. What about all these foreign countries? I assure you that the farms that are selling food into the United States have to go through this training and have to get inspected too. And then one small section of that Food Safety Modernization Act is called the Produce Safety Rule. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Produce Safety Rule because that's what I do. One of my responsibilities in the state is going all around the state and doing these trainings for folks who grow produce so that they can learn how to keep the produce safe. There are a lot of things they've been doing all their lives. Their father did before them, their grandfather. And they've never thought about, why do we do this way and is there a safer way to do it? So the training helps farmers to kind of think through that and kind of think about their practices on the farm and how they might change those to make things safer for their customers. So just kind of to help you understand the food safety, these are outbreaks associated with produce specifically from 1996 to 2014, which is the most recent chart that I see. You'll notice that by far the majority of things fall into two categories, and that's sprouts and leafy greens. The reason sprouts tend to be one of the more dangerous things to eat is because the way that the seeds that turn into sprouts are germinated are in warm water. And warm water is an awesome vector for foodborne illness. And once one of those little sprouts has a foodborne illness in it, the rest of those sprouts are kind of with it in a big drum, and that water just moves it and washes it through those. The sprouts growers have by far the most rigorous testing and requirements. They have their own separate portion of the rule to try to make sure that we can reduce those foodborne illnesses related to sprouts. The other one is leafy greens. Leafy greens are very often field harvested and field packed. So what happens is you have a tractor and they're pulling this big kind of contraption behind them where farm workers will cut it, put it on a conveyor belt, it'll get rinsed, they'll get wrapped, and it'll go in a bag. All this is done outside, it's done fairly quickly, and that can lead to some problems with foodborne illness. We also have the lettuce is very bumpy and it's difficult to keep clean, so that's another thing that we think about. That's also one of the primary problems with melons. Melons often have that netting on the outside. Melons are something we never think to wash before we cut into them. And if there's something on the outside of that melon and we cut a knife through, that knife can pull the foodborne illness right into the middle of the melon. Other things that have been a problem have been tomatoes, berries, both of those difficult to wash because they perish very quickly. And then we start looking into other things that are kind of smaller, like herbs, onions, and not quite as much of a problem here in the United States with mangoes and papayas. So if we look at these are the FDA recorded outbreaks. By far, bacteria are our biggest concern. They have the highest number of outbreaks, the highest number of illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths. So our goal is to bring down not only the deaths, but illnesses and hospitalizations. We all know that when you get ill, even if you don't die from your illness, sometimes you can have lifelong effects from that illness. So the goal is to bring those down to make sure that people, even if they do survive some kind of a foodborne illness, don't suffer the rest of their lives with some kind of complication. After bacteria, we move into parasitic, things like amoebas. That can be in the wash water from food, and then we ingest them and we can have problems from those. Viral, we'll talk about this a little bit later. Things like norovirus, we've all heard of on cruise ships. But those, because they're a lot less common on farms, tend to cause a lot fewer illnesses. So this is just to kind of jog your memory to think about some of the different things that I'm sure you've heard about on the news that are the causes of these foodborne illnesses. So the bacteria we're talking about are Salmonella, toxigenic E. coli. So there are a lot of different E. coli out there in the environment. Just a very small percentage of them are toxic to humans and cause human illness. So we're trying to reduce that specific kind of E. coli. And we do that through trying to reduce all E. coli, but that's our goal, is the toxigenic E. coli. And then Listeria. When we talk about the viruses, we're talking about mainly norovirus and hepatitis A. Both of those spread primarily through humans. And then parasites, Giardia, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, and Toxoplasma. I know in the Milwaukee area they had a Cryptosporidium outbreak. I believe it was in the 1990s that was very serious because it got in the public water supply. But all of these can make people very sick and are especially dangerous to people who have some kind of pre-existing condition, or if you have a compromised immune system because maybe you're on chemotherapy or you're on a medication that suppresses your immune system. So where do these pathogens come from on the farm? Our number one place that the pathogens come from are people. And we spend a ton of time working with farms about managing the people end of that. And just like we're doing everywhere now, a lot of it's about washing hands. I've been teaching people how to wash their hands for 20 seconds for a very long time. And now everybody's doing it. So we caught it ahead of the curve. But it's really important. We talk to people about using soap and water, which are by far the way to go. Hand sanitizer does not work on dirty hands, so you have to get the dirt off for the hand sanitizer to work. And on farms, that just isn't practical. If you've looked at a farmer's hands, you can see that sometimes that dirt is just kind of part of what's there. You can't get it off anymore. So it's really important for them to do that full 20 seconds of hand washing. And we talk to them about when to do that and how to do it, just to try to make sure that people's hands are clean when they're touching your food. The next place the pathogens come from are animals, and I think this is the first thing that people think of. Animals are out there in the environment. They're sharing the space with your produce. They're on your farm. You've got raccoons. You've got sandhill cranes. We've got deer. We've got squirrels. We've got bunnies. And those are just the wild animals that we have. A lot of folks have diversified farms where they might also have pigs or sheep or cows or dogs or cats. So all of those things are potentially a problem. Another problem potentially is water. If you think about irrigation and an open irrigation pond that's open to the environment, you can have birds that come in there, you can have deer that come and get a little drink of water. And to be honest, one of the things we talk about very prominently during these trainings is poop. The goal is to keep the poop off the food. It's to keep the people poop, the animal poop. Everybody's poop needs to be out and away from the food. So that's what we talk about, is making sure that that doesn't come anywhere near the food, because there's a risk there of having some kind of pathogen in the poop of people, the poop of animals, the poop of the cows. All of that is a potential risk. So we want to keep that all away so that we can kind of reduce that risk as much as possible. Soil is another place. There are a lot of farms to improve the quality of their soil, the tilth, the nutrient content, the water holding capacity. They use manure and compost. Manure and compost are awesome additives to improve the quality of your soil. And they're also awesome for your vegetables. But it's really important to use them properly. So we talk a lot about how to properly compost to make sure that manure is completely composted. And then we talk a lot about manure and how and when to apply manure to make sure that it's not a risk to produce. And then the last thing is equipment. There are a lot of ways to move different things around the farm. You can move it with a tractor, you can move it with your hands, you can move it with a pitchfork, and a lot of washing and cleaning that happens of the produce once it's picked. You need to keep all of that equipment clean and free of pathogens, human-borne pathogens, whenever possible, because the whole goal is for us to grow that safe, healthy produce and to get it to you in good conditions so that it doesn't cause any problems. So what are farmers doing to keep produce safe? They're going to training. Under the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule, farmers are required to go to a certification training. We hold those all over the state. We've trained over 600 farmers in the last 3 years in cooperation with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture. And only certain farms are required to fully comply with the rule. There's a lot of farms that are smaller, but we find that most of the attendees at these trainings are the smaller farms. They want to do this right. They want to have safe produce. They want to follow the same kinds of guidance and practices that the larger firms are following, because they want their produce to be just as safe as everyone else's. The larger farms that do fall completely under the rule, or they do primarily wholesaling, they're subject to inspection. The inspection is somebody comes onto the farm. In Wisconsin, that inspection is done by somebody who works for the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture. Right now, they're in kind of education mode. So their goal is not to shut anybody down, but to help make sure if they find anything wrong, they know how to correct it. And Extension is involved in kind of helping be the troubleshoot people. So if they know that they have a problem on their farm from this inspection process, they can come to Extension, and Extension can talk them through and say, hey, maybe we could do this, or would this work for you, to try to help them think of an option that would comply with the law. And then the Department of Agriculture is also doing kind of mock audits for anyone who asks. You don't have to be a farm that's subject to inspection to get one of these audits, but they will come out and take a look at the farm and look at what you're doing and give you some tips on where they see weaknesses and where they see strengths. So it's a really good tool for farmers. And we're finding that, farmers, the majority of farmers are really interested in getting engaged in the process and trying to do better. So they're all interested in using these resources to do things better on their farm. Washing their hands, we talked about this before, but we talk a lot about washing hands, when to wash your hands, after you eat, after you go to the bathroom, all sorts of times. So, we kind of hammer that home as one of our big things, and now everybody's washing their hands all the time. So farmers are scouting their fields. So before we go out there and pick something, we want to take a look around and try to figure out if there's anything potentially dangerous. You'll go out and decide that you're picking broccoli that day. You'll walk that field looking for deer poop, looking for signs of some kind of wildlife invasion. Sometimes this time of the year, you might get a considerable number of geese in a small area. And pretty much geese, all their job is to eat and poop. So we need to go out there, figure out, if there are any potential problems there. And then if we see something that's potentially a problem, we flag that off, or we make sure that, the folks that are picking know not to go in that area. And farms have a plan for their way to deal with those kinds of problems to make sure that, the produce that's getting picked doesn't have any of that on there. We're doing a lot of water testing. We want to make sure that the water that people are using for irrigation and washing and everything else on the farm is safe, because what's in that water can eventually get to you if we're not cautious. So we have folks test their irrigation water, and that has a certain standard. We're very lucky in Wisconsin because we have a lot of water testing labs, because dairies also have to test their water. Our neighbors in Minnesota have about 8 labs, and we have around 50. So people don't have to travel nearly as far to get a water test. And most of the water tests we're talking about have to be processed within 24 hours of taking the sample. So folks are testing their water and making sure that they have clean water. And then for water that's used post-harvest, there's even a higher standard. So depending on what you're doing on your farm, you may need to do 2 different tests. And some farms, depending on the source of their water, test more often if it's an open body of water versus a well. So they're working really hard to make sure that any water they use on the farm is as safe as possible. And if it's not safe, then they discontinue use and they figure out a plan to make it safer. Timing of manure applications, as I mentioned before, manure is very useful on the farm and really kind of essential for a lot of operations. So we talk about when to apply it and how to apply it to make sure by the time you're harvesting anything off of that land, there's relatively little chance of there being any kind of plant pathogens there or human pathogens there. And then cleaning and sanitizing equipment. Sometimes it seems like a lot of cleaning, but if you're gonna go use the pitchfork to clean out the hen house, you're not gonna wanna use that for the potatoes. It's really important for people to think through their processes and think through the way they're doing things and making sure that things are cleaned and sanitized when needed and appropriately. So farms go through a process where they think about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and they make some plans. And sometimes they write out the steps of how to sanitize and when to clean and sanitize so that it's consistent and it's being done right. So that's the produce safety part. But now we're going to talk a little bit about once that safe produce is grown and picked and on its way to you, how during this time of COVID are farmers trying to make sure that you're safe to buying your produce? So the most important thing to know is that COVID is not a foodborne illness. You cannot get COVID from eating food. It is a respiratory illness. It needs to go into your lungs through your nose or through your mouth, but it needs to hit your lungs in order to infect. So COVID is not something that we need to be terribly concerned about when we're talking about eating produce. The spread of COVID is mainly person to person. So this is where farmers markets and pick your owns we're going to talk about are really focusing their efforts. Their goal is to make sure that people aren't spreading it to other people and that everyone is staying safe and still being able to access their products. And then farmers who sell produce directly to customers are taking their steps to keep themselves and their customers safe. So I think one of the things when we're at the farmers market, or if we're thinking about pick your own operations, we do some pick your own stuff on our farm. I'm not sure everyone thinks about how critical the farmer is in this scenario. I know on our farm, if my husband gets sick, it's a wash. There's no one to replace him. Farmers work a tremendous amount. They know things that other people on the farm don't know. My husband works 100 hours a week, every single week of the growing season. And there's just no way to replace him, even with 3 people. He knows things that I don't know. He knows how to use certain tractors and certain equipment. And I think this is true for a lot of farm families. You've got that one linchpin person that kind of makes everything run and just has an amazing wealth of knowledge. And if that person goes down or gets seriously ill, that can be a serious consequence for that entire family and the family of those people who work for them. So it's really critical, not only for the farmers to keep other people safe, but it's really critical for farmers to think about keeping themselves safe and their family members safe and their workers safe also. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is farmers markets. In my capacity and extension, I also work with a national group called the Farmers Market Coalition. We meet on a regular basis, especially now. Most states have requirements for farmers markets that they must meet to keep customers and farmers safe, but Wisconsin doesn't have those. So there is guidance through the Department of Health, the Department of Ag, and the Extension that kind of help farmers markets think through where they're at their location with their vendors, and how to kind of work with their very local situation. We try to help markets understand that a market in downtown Milwaukee is very different from a market in rural Pierce County. There's different numbers of people, there's different amounts of space, there's different rates of COVID infection. So we encourage the market manager and those involved in the market to talk to the local health officials. So go down there and talk to them, engage them, say, what's our current situation of these recommendations and the guidance? Which ones do you think make the most sense for our market? And then market managers go back and make those rules for the market. They may also have the local health department involved. A lot of health departments approve the markets, so they have to kind of have buy-in from the local health department. They may have boards or other stakeholders that need to be involved in that process, but it's super important that people have a really good understanding of what's going on locally so that they can make good decisions about what's safe for their community. I mentioned the guidance that was developed for farmers markets. The Department of Ag, Department of Health, and Extension came together and made sure that their guidance was all the same. We didn't want to send mixed messages. We didn't want the health department saying, well, DHS says this and Extension says this, and there being, disagreement about what the best practices were. We wanted to make sure that the local health departments and local farmers were all on the same page and were aware of the same types of things that could be done at markets. And then each market makes their own rules and is responsible for enforcing their own rules. This is a really hard situation for market managers to be in because in a farmer's market, you're always doing too much and not enough all at the same time. So you kind of get it from all angles. I have tremendous respect for the market managers. We have a little over 300 farmers markets in the state. I only know of 2 that did not, that decided that they just weren't going to do it this year because it would have been too complicated. So there are a lot of really hardworking market managers out there, taking criticism from all sides because they're, not doing enough and they're doing too much all at the same time. So this is a really awesome graphic that was put together by the Farmers Market Association in Alaska. And this really goes through a lot of the key things that farmers markets in Wisconsin are doing. One, they're encouraging folks to stay home if they're sick, talking about covering nose and mouth, following signage, 1 shopper per household, washing or sanitizing hands, social distancing, washing produce, and leaving pets at home. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those. This was a sign put together by the Menominee Farmers Market up in the Northwest. They wanted to make sure that everybody knew that masks were required coming into the market. And so they made this nice sign up to make sure that people are aware of it. They also made sure that they had extra masks so that if people came into the market and they didn't bring one with them, they had one that they could get right there. And then people who weren't willing to wear a mask, they, calmly explained the situation to them and said, we have one for you if you'd like one. This is why we're doing this. And if you choose not to wear a mask, we're going to ask you not to come to the market. So it takes a lot of thinking and kind of thinking things through and handling things very carefully. But this is one of the things that markets are doing to try to keep folks safe. Another one is making space between vendors. I talked a little bit about keeping those farmers safe. This helps a lot with that. Farmers, the booths are usually right up against each other. There's usually no space between those tents. So the actual farmers are, within a couple of feet of each other for the entire market. And that's potentially risky. So this market had a ton of space and a really good situation. So they were able to really space out their vendors. Spacing out the vendors helps the vendors, but it also helped keep the customers who wanted to social distance and maintain that 6 feet of distance. It gave them plenty of space to walk around and not kind of get closed in. Normally this farmer's market would have booths that were all the way next to each other, but they would also have them on both sides. So that kind of keeps the customers in this narrow aisle. So instead of doing that, they've chosen to go on one side. And that way there's a lot more space for those lines to go out in one direction, and people don't have to interact with those people when they go from booth to booth. Another strategy for social distancing are barriers. So this vendor has put out in front of her normal table where people would generally come right up and talk to her and look at things. She's put a barrier table out there to try to give herself a little bit more room. And it helps that she doesn't have to constantly remind people that, hey, can you please stay back? Or, that kind of gives her a little bit of insurance that people are going to give her a little more space. She's also set it up so that people can read the boards. They can stay back themselves. And generally what people do in this situation is they will see something, they will ask for it, and they can do the transaction, and that kind of minimizes the amount of time that folks are interacting or nearby other people. And there are a lot of different ways to do that interaction that can kind of minimize the face-to-face contact or how close people get. Another one is lines. I really like this. Maintain social distance, keep 1 cow apart. Very appropriate for the farmers market. This one is also the Menominee market. The market manager, Veronica, there is awesome. She's very creative. These signs are actually for the egg roll vendor. No one wanted the egg roll vendor to go. Everyone loved the egg rolls, but the line got kind of crazy. So the market manager was trying to put everyone's health first, but also get them their egg rolls. And she made these signs and she puts them up every week to give people some space and to make sure people know that they need to kind of keep some social distancing between. The second picture, if you can see the cones, and a person will stand at each one of these cones. So you're at the first cone, you're second in line, you move into the tent and you're still 6 feet away. And then you have the cone right next to the sweet corn bin. And when you get to that, you can pick your sweet corn. That bin of corn was sold out in less than an hour. People moved very quickly through, but still were able to maintain their social distancing. So, part of the goal here is to make sure that the farmers can sell their stuff. And doing that efficiently really helps the volume of sales. So you don't want to slow down too much or make it too difficult for people to buy things, because you still want to move a lot of people through that and have people be able to sell their produce. But we also want to keep that distancing to keep people safe. Eliminating sampling. Who doesn't want to try a sweet cherry at the farmer's market? This is one of the growers from up Door County. They drive all the way down from Door County to the Brookfield Farmers Market to sell their sweet cherries when they're in season. But sampling, although it's really tricky for a lot of vendors to let go of sampling, I know we have popcorn vendors and other food vendors that want people to sample because it sells more product. But the idea of somebody pulling their mask down and putting their fingers to their mouth is just a bad idea. Saliva on your fingers is not a good idea. You've pulled your mask down, you've potentially gotten saliva on your fingers, and then you're not washing your hands. And that's the primary reason it's a risk. We're trying to keep your food and not spread it around, because we know those droplets are one of the ways that COVID gets around. So that's why temporarily we're encouraging people not to sample at the farmer's market. Some markets are doing directing foot traffic, so they have signs. The only problem with this sign is I have learned that a lot of younger people, including my children, cannot read cursive. So this is for those of us who were taught cursive in school. But the idea here is that if you have traffic going one way, people aren't crossing near each other in opposite directions face to face. So some of the markets have gone to clockwise or counterclockwise and trying to make sure that traffic is moving in one direction. Other strategies that farmers markets are using, one is pre-order or pickup. I know that the Dane County Farmers Market, the largest producer-only farmers market in the entire country, has gone to pre-order and pickup for produce. That is a location, if you've ever been there, that is particularly difficult to social distance. Every time I've been to that market, it is just completely packed and you're practically shoulder to shoulder with folks. So the Dane County Health Department decided that that just wasn't going to work. So they've moved to a pre-order and pickup system that has been working really well for them. I'm sure that they are looking forward to the market returning to normal, hopefully next year. But that is working. People order online and pay online, and then they can just do a drive-through pickup. Contactless, where you can just pop your trunk and somebody can put your produce in your trunk. So it works really well. It's a really nice option for people who are high risk that are especially concerned about going to a market. Some markets are limiting number of attendees, so they're making a kind of a closed loop on the market and having one or two entrances, and only certain numbers of people are allowed in the market at a time. This is one of the rules that they have to follow in Michigan. They have to figure out their square foot area, and they can have a maximum number of attendees. I anticipate that as we move into the winter market season and people are moved indoors, we'll see more of this. But the goal of this is so that people have enough space to be able to social distance properly. Prohibiting pets is never popular at markets that usually allow pets, because part of the beauty and joy of those markets is that seeing other people's dogs and petting other people's dogs and talking to other people. So to be honest, that's exactly why we're asking people to limit pets at the farmers market. It really does facilitate a lot more personal interaction. People kind of dawdle at the market a little more and spend more time. And the more time you're at the market and the closer you are to people, the higher the risk. So that is just a goal of trying to minimize people's risk at the market and minimize their time there. Most markets are also providing hand sanitizer and hand washing facilities, so that you can do that very easily. If you pick up something or you touch something and you feel that it's time to get the hand sanitizer out, that's there. And some of them have even created hand washing stations for folks. Those are also there for the vendors so that they can make sure that they're washing their hands regularly and keeping your produce safe. Prepackaging food. This is more about bakery. This is one of the original recommendations. And a lot of this doesn't necessarily have to do with somebody sneezing on your bread and then you eating it. It's to encourage people not to eat at the market. So the goal is we talked about that whole taking down your mask and putting food and possibly getting some saliva on your fingers. And lots of markets are markets where people eat ready-to-eat food. They eat their bakery on site. They kind of hang out, and that's a beautiful thing, and I love those markets. But right now, that's not something we want to do. So prepackaging food so that you can still have your favorite goodies, but you take them home and eat them, is why prepackaging is encouraged. And then related to that is that no on-site eating. A lot of markets are removing picnic tables and seating areas just to discourage people from kind of hanging out and interacting with larger numbers of people. Farmers markets are still an amazingly great place to shop. You still have all that produce. You're in an open air environment. You don't have to worry about the risk of recirculated air. There's lots of space. So I think farmers markets in general, even though we don't have any kind of statewide regulation, are doing a really great job of trying to keep their customers and their farmers safe. So the next thing we're going to talk about is pick your own. And during these times of kind of feeling stuck at home and not being able to go to the movies and not being able to go to as many places, the idea of being outside where there's lots of free-flowing air and picking some berries or picking some apples or taking the kids to get pumpkins is just a really fun idea. And people want to get out and they want to do something and they want to feel a little bit normal. And going to a pick your own operation can give you that kind of sense of normalcy and have a great family activity. But pick your own operations are thinking about their customers too and trying to make sure that you can come there and feel safe while you're there and reduce that risk of the potential of getting sick because you're around other people. Guidance was also developed for Pick Your Own Farms by the Department of Agriculture, and that's out there for farmers to kind of go through and assess their risk and try to figure out which things apply to them and their operation. And that's really what it's all about. Just like the farmers markets, it's about pick your own operations, thinking about how many people are usually here. Are there surfaces that I need to make sure are clean? How do I keep my employees safe in the context of my specific operation? No two farms are exactly alike, so folks need to, sit down and think through what they're doing and how they might tweak it to make it a little bit safer. One of the things that Pick Your Own operations are concerned about is protecting their employees. So you've got picking crews that are out there and you want to make sure that your picking crews are staying safe, and that can be done by creating crews so you always work with the same 2 or 3 people instead of rotating people around and exposing them to more people. A lot of people who pick either do piecemeal, which means you get paid by the volume of what you pick or the weight of what you pick. So you have to be fast, and to be fast, you really need to be in good health. So to protect their income and their ability to provide for their family, they really need to be healthy. And even hourly employees, if workers aren't sick or are sick, they can be a food safety risk, or they may be sick enough that they need to stay home. And those workers need to provide for their families too. So we need to try to keep them healthy. They are doing some farms are doing health assessments where they take the temperature of their workers, and they ask them to evaluate different symptoms if they've had any of them prior to coming to work. Many farms are asking employees to wear masks, especially if they're very close to other workers. Social distancing. So depending on what you're picking, that's easier for some. Sometimes it's about putting crews in different blocks and keeping them separate. Hand washing. And then the other thing that a lot of farms are worried about is keeping their cashiers safe. If you're going out to the apple trees and you're picking your apples and you're coming back and you need to have them weighed, or you're looking at buying other products that they're selling at their store, that cashier really interacts with a large volume of people. And a lot of pick your own operations are doing things like plexiglass and social distancing to try to keep their cashiers and their employees safe. One of the things they're doing is an awareness of the number of customers. It can get really super busy in an apple orchard on a really beautiful fall day, or a pumpkin picking farm. And some of the pick your own operations are really thinking about how many people is it safe to have in this area, so that people aren't shoulder to shoulder and really close to each other and are able to social distance properly. Maintaining spacing between groups. So if you're in one area picking apples, they might only put 2 families in that tree block and ask you to stay in that tree block, so that there aren't too many people in there. So they might also be spacing by time. So some farms are asking people to do tickets, and you get kind of an appointment to come in at 10:30, and they'll only have so many families that can come in at 10:30, and then they'll have the next picking time at 11 o'clock. So they're trying to manage it so that you can come and have your experience and the fun and joy of that, but you don't have to put yourself at risk doing it. Another thing they're doing is encouraging customer safety. So this is always a difficult thing to do with your customers. You want customers to come, you want them to feel welcome, you want them to buy your stuff because this is your business. But you also want to try to encourage them to be safe. There's no way to kind of enforce that in any kind of meaningful way. But some of the things that folks are asking people to do are washing their hands. This comes in for food safety, the produce safety part too. Is if you have visitors on your farm, you're supposed to make sure they know where the bathrooms are and the hand washing facilities. And you're supposed to encourage them to wash their hands before they go out and pick, just as a precautionary measure to make sure that folks wash their hands and hopefully do it properly. I know there are a couple of farms out there that even demonstrate 20 seconds of hand washing. So they can try to keep their customers safe. Some operations are asking folks to wear masks, especially if they're going into like a store or something like that where it's more of an enclosed area. They're encouraging social distancing. So within your family group, social distancing isn't really necessary. These are the people you live with, if you're related to them or not, people you're in close contact with. They're more than happy to have you out there with those folks, but the goal is to kind of limit cross contact with folks that you don't normally interact with. Limiting the number of people in stores. Those stores can be awful small and they got a lot of stuff packed into them. So they might ask you to have just one member of your family go in there, or they might say there's only 8 people out at the store at a time. Once somebody comes out, they'll let somebody else in. but that, that's the determination of the actual pick your own operation. And then they are being encouraged to eliminate sampling. I love sampling apples when I go there. I always end up in the store looking at some apples that I didn't pick that I'd like to buy. And I always end up with too many apples and just, doing a lot of baking and things. But sampling right now is just not a good idea. And we've already been through the reasons why. Other things that are, things that the folks at Pick Your Owns are considering, petting zoos. This is kind of like dogs at the farmer's market. It encourages people to hang around. You're bringing your kids, you're bringing lots of people. If the cute little goat's up at the fence, you're going to have a group of like 5 or 6 kids just like really super close right there. So that's one of the things to consider. Playgrounds, there's just no reasonable way to keep playgrounds clean. So if you have a bunch of kids on a playground that's a potential risk. So Pick Your Own operations have to consider, what they're doing there and how they can do it safely, or if they can do it safely. On-site food. Everyone loves to eat when they go to the apple orchard. You get an apple dumpling or a piece of pie or a hand pie. And really those things are best taken home to eat. Hay rides, lots of people, small vehicle. It can be tricky. Might need more trips back and forth. But hay rides are something that people have to consider, the risk there. And then haunted houses. I know that a lot of operations do haunted houses, and is there a safe way to do that, and how might that be accomplished? So all of this isn't a you can't do it kind of a situation. We're not doing that here in Wisconsin, but it is about farm operations taking the time to think about how they can do things as safely as possible for their safety as well as the safety of their customers. So the last thing is eating on site. A lot of families will bring a picnic lunch and eat in the orchard, or have food on site and eat in the orchard, or at tables or picnic tables at the orchard. So that's one of those things that is discouraged. Just again, keep those masks on if you can, or keep socially distanced away from people, and keep your hands away from your mouth if at all possible, because really, if we can keep those 3 things going well, then hopefully we can reduce the spread and get back to our lives as normal as soon as possible. So this is kind of a wrap-up slide. Produce safety is people safety. So farmers use good agricultural practices like hand washing and timing of manure applications and scouting for animals to prevent and reduce that risk of foodborne illness to their customers and the people eating their produce. Farmers and farmers markets are using a lot of different strategies to reduce the spread of COVID-19. These are all strategies that they've thought through and tried to match the right strategies for their market. Customers play a really important role in their safety and the safety of others. So it's not only having the rules, but it's having people willing to follow them and willing to kind of be courteous to others. We all know that masks aren't specifically for our own protection, but they're really to catch all of our saliva droplets and our aerosol coming out of our mouth before it goes past the mask. So masks are primarily to protect other people from you, and since you're most contagious before you show symptoms, and then people never show symptoms even if they do have COVID-19, it's just a courteous thing to show that you care about the people around you. And then buying local food supports our economy. Are still working just as hard as they ever have. They need to sell their product in order to support their families and their farm business and their employees. So buying local is still a really awesome way to keep money in your community and support your tax base and get really fresh food that tastes awesome. So just because we're in a global pandemic shouldn't dissuade you from buying local food. We're just going to go about it in a little bit different way to keep you safe. So now I have time for questions. I have a few different little websites up here just so that you can understand, so you can find information. One is to learn more about UW-Madison Extension. We have an office in each of the 72 counties, and we offer a variety of different programming from 4-H to parenting to horticulture to farming help and things like that. So just a way for you to connect with Extension and all the great things that we do and we can offer to the folks all over the state of Wisconsin. The next one is just to help you find your local county extension office to figure out who's there, what kind of educators they have, and how you might connect with them. Another is getting yard and garden questions answered. I work in horticulture, and part of what horticulture people do across the state is help people, successfully grow their vegetables and figure out what's wrong with their blue spruce and all those kind of things. And there's a form on there, so no matter what county you are in the state, you can fill out that little form and it will go to the person nearest you, and they will get back to you with an answer about what they think it is or more questions to help you figure it out. And then the last one is shameless self-promotion. This is our produce safety page. If you grow produce or you know somebody who does that could benefit from education, or there's just a ton of resources on that page, then that's the web address for it. And that is all that I have. So if there are questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Kristin. I'll start off priming the pump here on the questions just by asking, what's been the impact on restaurants and the relationship between farmers who sell directly to restaurants in your experience around Wisconsin? I'm wondering how that's affected people.
I would say more than just Wisconsin. It's been really unfortunate. There are farmers who specialize in selling to restaurants, and restaurants are doing less business and in places not open, or some restaurants have chosen not to open. So a lot of that produce, we have been working really hard behind the scenes to try to redirect it to other places. And one of the places we're trying to redirect it to are food pantries and food assistance organizations and places that are doing meals for people locally. So there are dollars through the federal government to help buy that produce so that the farmers are getting a fair price for it, just like they did with the dairy program. So the goal is to get products that folks are producing and give them a fair price to keep them going, but make sure that food goes to somebody who can use it and needs it.
Good, thank you. And then Kendall, do you have any questions from the chat that you'd like to pose to Kristin?
Yes, so there's one that I believe is about the first part of the talk. It says, you seem to be saying the rules are in an introductory phase rather than an enforcement phase. Has this been happening since 2011?
So the law got passed in 2011. The law was written by, so this is not a USDA, it's not under the USDA umbrella, it's under the FDA. The Food and Drug Administration are used to sanitary facilities. So when they wrote the rule, they kind of didn't quite understand some particulars about farming and this whole growing things outdoor thing. It's not a hairnet, everything stainless steel kind of environment. So there were some periods of comment and kind of a lot of discussion that delayed the rule until 2016, which is when it went into force. And we have been doing a lot of education, trying to make sure that they had the training in advance of the inspections. Inspections were supposed to start full force with all of the regulation except for one around manure application. But because of COVID and because of some questions about the legitimacy of the way water is being tested, they're trying to move farmers. They're in this educational phase, trying to move farmers much closer to being completely in compliance without asking them to be completely in compliance until everything is settled. So unfortunately, it's not the kind of a regulation that is completely cut and dry. There's a lot of nuance in it, and some of it's still being sorted out.
Thank you. And then there's a second one that says, you said earlier COVID was not a factor on food. However, you also point out that saliva on hands is a problem. Would saliva and sneezes get on produce if not handled safely? Does the virus last on greens and containers about the same time they last on metal and plastic?
Okay, so the saliva thing is more of a problem with me touching this and then touching my nose. So I'm not worried about me touching my mouth and then touching the produce. I'm worried about me touching, getting saliva on my fingers and touching my nose, or touching someone else's hand or something else where they're going to touch their face. So it's still the respiratory kind of pathway. But once you have that kind of free saliva out there, it could be, I touch the watermelon, you touch the watermelon, I touch my face with, you know what I mean? So it's that process. We're not really terribly concerned about the produce part. Eating the watermelon that was sneezed on is not nearly as risky as me touching the watermelon and touching my nose. So the second part of that was, does the virus last on greens and containers about the same time as it lasts on metal and plastic? So one of the things that's been coming out recently is the original dose that they were putting on metal and plastic to measure the number of hours the virus stayed on there was really, really, really high. So they've really kind of backed off a little bit on the idea that surfaces are really as risky as we used to think they are. We're back to thinking that it's primarily people-to-people spread. Viruses on greens and containers, there's a ton of different things that would, on greens, there's a ton of different things that would impact that. It would be things like temperature, moisture, number of days. But again, if I sneeze on lettuce, lettuce is not a very good surface for viruses to survive on. And viruses, even if they're alive, they degrade. So they can degrade to the point where they can't infect someone, but they can still be alive. So when it comes to produce and eating produce, as long as I'm not taking very recently infected produce and putting it up to my nose, I think the risk there is really minimal. If you're a high-risk individual, I think you should be taking as many precautions as you can to make sure that you don't get infected. But I think that really, if we can focus on the social distancing, wear a mask, and I think that we're really a good deal of the way there, and we should be less concerned about the food and the surfaces, and the hand washing is the third one, and the washing your hands. So, so metal and plastic, I don't think the CDC is saying that it persists on those nearly as long as it used to, but still wash your hands.
Other questions? Any others in the chat, Kendall? Or those are two?
Those are the only two in the chat.
Okay.
Are there any standardized signage so we can know when we're buying goods, not necessarily at the farmer's market, but locally produced goods at our local groceries, for how this was safely handled?
So, people who primarily wholesale, so if over half your sales are going wholesale to, let's say, somebody who's redistributing it, they are required to be certified. So they have a certificate. I don't think that there's a way that grocery stores are going to kind of put that out there. The other thing I will mention is that in addition to this certification, most grocery stores or most redistributors of food require what's called a third-party audit. So they want somebody else to come in there and do an inspection. It's a lot like the organic inspection to make sure you're growing organically. But there are a plethora of private organizations that provide these third-party audits, in addition to one from the USDA called the Harmonized Audit. But in general, most food that is moving through a wholesale chain to a grocery store, unless it's, sweet corn from the guy down the road, is probably subject to either a third-party audit or this certification. Nobody likes risk. The world is run on risk management these days. I have learned that very acutely. So the farmer doesn't want to be at risk. The grocery store doesn't want to be at risk. The trucker doesn't want to be at risk. So they're trying to put in as many kind of safeties as they can to prevent anything from happening.
And Kristin, how does that compare, this third-party non-governmental certification, how does that compare to what federal or state regulations are for meat packing?
I have no idea about the meat packing certifications. I'm sorry.
Okay, because my understanding is there are federal inspectors for meat and poultry.
Oh, so the state inspection versus the federal?
Yeah, and that they're employees of the state government who are doing the inspections, either the state government or the USDA. But your third party, these are not government employees.
The only third party that's done by a government organization, so the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture is a contractual agent of the USDA, and they do the harmonized gap audit for them.
Okay.
And they get paid for the audits. It's kind of it's a contractual thing. It's actually a very similar thing to the produce safety inspections that are being done. Because it's a federal rule and the state of Wisconsin doesn't have its own rule, the state of Wisconsin can't do the inspections themselves. They have to be federally credentialed to do that. And that's the way both the actual produce safety rule inspections and these third-party USDA harmonized gap audits are run.
There are more interesting parts of law than food law, but not very many. And it's I bet you.
Maybe tax law.
Well, you went to Purdue, and I remember the horticulture book that I can't remember the professor's name who wrote the horticulture
Janik?
book. Yes, Janik. Reading about that, and even as an undergrad, that a tomato might be a fruit to a botanist, but it's a vegetable to a lawyer. And that was my introduction to how complicated food law can be, especially when you have the USDA, the FDA, in some cases the EPA, and then the state agencies, and then these third-party certifiers. It's all, you're right when you say, boy, you got to think about how you're going to handle risk.
Yeah, and that's the goal of the harmonized gap audit, was try to take all the other audits and try to hybridize them into one everyone would take. Because you might sell to Walmart and they want this certification, and then you might go to a different store and they want a different audit, and audits are expensive. So the goal was to try to get something everybody could live with.
Are there any other questions for Kristin?
Excuse me, I was wondering how many states do have regulations, and do you know why Wisconsin does not?
So within the North Central region, which is about 13 states, and I definitely know the only other state that doesn't have the regulation is North Dakota. All of the rest of them have some level of organization, or guidance or expectation around the COVID related to farmers markets. I think some of it just has to do more with politics and what people will tolerate than other things. It's hard to get around that. It's hard to get around the perception of things and just drill down to the science of things. And I understand that it can be hard because there are a lot of voices that are out there that are saying different things. So it's hard to kind of make sense of the path forward when you've got different people that say things that don't agree.
Kendall, I see a third chat. Is there a third question in the chat line?
No, they just said thank you for the talk.
Oh, great. Kristin, one last one for me at least. As farmers markets have gone into the winter, which is something that I don't remember them doing when I was a kid in the 1890s. What are you facing with COVID and going into the winter now where you have indoor markets?
It's challenging. So markets aren't, it's not necessarily a good idea for a lot of the spaces that were previously used for markets where we kind of pack people in, because that's it's kind of the part of the strategy of farmers markets to have booths near each other and kind of it leads you from one booth to the other and moves you through the market. And there's all sorts of marketing strategy going on there. But a lot of those spaces were pretty full. And it was hard to get around even in the winter because you wanted to make sure you got to the bakery guy and the cheese guy. And even though there's less produce there, there's still plenty of vendors there. So most of those markets are looking at options like bigger spaces, alternating weeks. So they'll have half of their vendors there one week and half of their vendors there another week. Some of them are looking at pickup options where you could pre-order, and then there would be like limited number of people walk in. But it's challenging. It's really challenging because I think everybody thought we'd be done with this by now, that things would be back to normal by now and that they could move into their normal winter market. And within the last 2 weeks, we've learned that the chances are that this will not resolve until the end of the winter market season at the earliest.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, if not, thank you very much, Kristin. I appreciate this. Thanks for everybody for coming in and listening here at the time of our fall harvest and harvest moon coming up. And oh no, harvest moon was the first one of October. As a plant pathologist person from long ago, this is really fascinating. You get to hear all the different things that people are doing now from a commercial point of view to grow and to deliver with confidence local fruits and vegetables, and the way that you develop relationships between producers and customers is really pretty fascinating. Very different than my memory of being a kid when we didn't have farmers markets that I ever went to until I came here as a grad student in Madison in the early 80s. So really appreciate it. And thanks again, everybody. Hope to see you next week. And we'll have Ankur Desai talking about weird, unexpected ways that climate change might affect us. Thanks again, Kristin, and look forward to seeing folks next week.
The recording has stopped.